Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, London was a city asleep. A sprawling metropolis of timber, pitch, and thatch, crammed within ancient Roman walls. It was a city that had just survived a devastating plague, a city praying for a return to normalcy. But in a small bakery on a narrow lane, a single forgotten ember glowed. This tiny spark, in the oven of the king's baker, would soon ignite a firestorm, an inferno so vast and terrifying it would erase the medieval city from existence and forever be known as the Great Fire of London. London in 1666 was a city caught between ages, a medieval labyrinth straining to contain the pressures of a new era. It was a city built of wood and whispers. The Great Plague of the previous year had scythed through its population, leaving a lingering trauma and an air of fragile recovery. Now, under the restored monarchy of King Charles II, a nervous energy pulsed through its veins. The whispers were of politics and plots, of resentments simmering since the Civil War, and of the ever-present fear of Catholic conspiracy. But more tangible than any rumor was the very fabric of the city itself. London was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Its streets were a chaotic tangle of narrow, winding lanes, darkened by the jettied upper stories of timber-framed houses that nearly touched in the middle. These structures were coated in pitch to waterproof them, and often roofed with flammable thatch. Inside, they were filled with wooden furniture, textiles, and the clutter of 17th century life. The long, hot summer had baked the city dry, turning every beam and board into kindling. A persistent easterly wind had blown for weeks, a seemingly innocent detail that would soon prove catastrophic. This was a city that lived by the River Thames, its great artery for commerce and transport. But its defenses against its oldest enemy, fire, were tragically primitive. There was no organized fire brigade. Each parish had its own set of leather buckets, crude ladders, and rudimentary hand-operated water pumps known as squirts, which were woefully inadequate for anything more than a small house fire. The prevailing wisdom for tackling a major blaze was drastic and destructive. Create a fire break by pulling down houses with long fire hooks, or in extreme cases, using gunpowder for demolition. It was a brutal but effective method, yet one that required swift, decisive leadership. As the citizens of London settled down on the night of Saturday, September 1st, they were blissfully unaware of the forces conspiring against them. The dry wood, the strong wind, and a simple act of carelessness in a small bakery were about to converge, unleashing a cataclysm that would reshape their world forever. The calamity that would bring London to its knees began in the dead of night, in a place as mundane as a baker's oven. In the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, a small, overlooked ember glowed within the bakery of Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane. Farriner, who served as baker to the king's household, had checked his ovens before retiring to bed, believing them to be extinguished. He was mistaken. Sometime around 1 a.m, the residual heat ignited nearby firewood. The flames found easy purchase on the dry timber of the house, and the fire began its insidious growth. The family, Farriner, his wife, his daughter, and a manservant, were woken by the choking smoke and intense heat. They scrambled to safety, climbing out of an upstairs window and traversing the rooftops to a neighbor's house. Tragically, Their maidservant, paralyzed by fear, did not follow. She remained behind, becoming the first recorded victim of the Great Fire. Initially, the blaze was a local affair. Neighbors were roused, and the parish constable was summoned. But the fire had started in a neighborhood packed with warehouses and workshops, all brimming with combustible materials. The Star Inn, adjacent to the bakery, was filled with hay and straw. Wharves along the nearby Thames were stacked with oil, tallow, coal, timber, and spirits. These weren't just fuel. They were explosives in waiting. As the flames consumed Farriner's bakery, the strong easterly wind, which had been a constant for weeks, began to play its devastating role. It fanned the fire, breathing life into it, turning it from a house fire into a hungry monster. It picked up burning embers and flung them onto the thatched roofs and wooden eaves of neighboring buildings. The initial response was futile. Citizens formed bucket chains from the river, but the heat was already too intense to get close. The parish's primitive water engines were no match for the inferno. The fire leaped from house to house with terrifying speed, the jettied upper floors creating a deadly bridge for the flames across the narrow lanes. Within an hour, what began as a spark in Pudding Lane was no longer a containable incident. It was a conflagration, a moving wall of fire, beginning its relentless westward march into the heart of the sleeping city. As dawn broke on Sunday morning, it revealed a scene of escalating horror. The fire, now a raging inferno, had consumed Pudding Lane and was spreading with terrifying velocity. Driven by the relentless easterly wind, it swept down Fish Street Hill towards the Thames, its primary target, the densely packed warehouses lining the riverbank. These buildings were the lifeblood of London's commerce, and they became the engine of its destruction. They were filled to the rafters with highly flammable goods, brandy, oil, tar, and tallow. As the fire reached them, they erupted in a series of spectacular and terrifying explosions, sending showers of sparks and burning debris across the city. The heat became so intense that it melted the lead roof of the great church of St. Magnus the Martyr, sending molten metal cascading into the streets below. A critical blow to the city's defenses came at London Bridge. The bridge itself was a fire hazard, lined with houses and shops built from timber. More importantly, at its northern end were the waterworks, a system of water wheels that pumped river water into the surrounding neighborhoods. The fire quickly destroyed these wheels, cutting off the main water supply for any firefighting efforts in the area. The flames then took hold of the houses on the bridge, effectively sealing it as an escape route to the south and creating a terrifying spectacle of fire over water. The human response during these first fatal hours was a mixture of disbelief, panic, and chaos. Many citizens, waking to the growing roar and the smoke-filled sky, initially underestimated the danger. They focused not on fleeing, but on saving their possessions. The narrow streets became gridlocked, with people pushing carts laden with their worldly goods, desperately trying to move them to safety or to the river, where a flotilla of boats was rapidly assembling. The famous diarist Samuel Pepys, an official in the Navy office, observed the fire's progress from a distance. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he took it upon himself to travel to Whitehall and inform King Charles II directly. By mid-morning, it was clear to all that this was no ordinary blaze. The ad hoc efforts of citizens and parish constables were utterly useless. The fire had taken on a life of its own. a monstrous entity that was consuming London block by block, and the city's authorities seemed powerless to stop it. In the face of an unprecedented crisis, a city looks to its leader for decisive action. In 1666, London looked to its Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, and found him tragically wanting. When Bloodworth was awakened and brought to the scene in the early hours of Sunday morning, the fire was still, in relative terms, in its infancy. The established and indeed the only effective method for halting such a blaze was to create fire breaks by demolishing buildings in its path. His advisors urged him to give the order. His response would go down in history as a catastrophic failure of judgment. Surveying the scene, he uttered his infamous dismissive words, "Pish, a woman might piss it out." With that, he refused to authorize demolitions and returned home to bed. Bloodworth's hesitation was not born purely of incompetence, but of a crippling fear of the consequences. As Lord Mayor, he was legally and financially responsible for the city. Demolishing private property, even to save the city, was a costly business. The owners of the destroyed houses would have to be compensated, and Bloodworth was terrified of the endless lawsuits and the immense financial burden this would place upon the city's coffers. He was a merchant, not a military commander, and his instinct was to protect the city's finances rather than its physical structure. He insisted he could not act without a direct order from the king. This bureaucratic paralysis, this deferral of responsibility at the most critical moment, was a death sentence for much of London. The window of opportunity to contain the fire was small, and Bloodworth slammed it shut. While he slept, the fire did not. It raged, it grew, it fed on the timber houses and the contents of the riverside warehouses. By the time he and other officials finally grasped the scale of the disaster, it was too late. The small fire a woman could supposedly extinguish had become a firestorm that no army could control. The failure of leadership was absolute. His indecision allowed the fire to cross from the eastern edge of the city into its wealthy, dense heart. The crucial first hours were lost to inaction. While King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, would later take command and organize demolition parties with some success, the damage was done. The Great Fire of London was fueled by wood and wind, but it was enabled by a mayor's fatal indecision. The ink on the Pragmatic Sanction was barely dry, a document painstakingly crafted by Emperor Charles VI to secure his daughter's inheritance. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the crowned heads of Europe would honor their solemn oaths. Letters of condolence and reassurance arrived in Vienna, filled with hollow promises of support for the young Archduchess. But these words were as substantial as smoke, carried away on a treacherous political wind that was beginning to blow cold from the north. The first gust of this betrayal came not from the traditional Habsburg rivals in France or Spain, but from an upstart kingdom to the northeast, Prussia. Its new king, Frederick II, was a man of ambition, unburdened by honor. He saw not a rightful heir in Maria Theresa, but a vulnerable young woman presiding over a treasury depleted by recent wars and an army in disarray. In December 1740, without a formal declaration of war, Frederick's highly disciplined troops stormed across the border into the rich province of Silesia. It was an act of breathtaking cynicism, a gangster's move on the international stage. Maria Theresa, still in deep mourning for her father and navigating the complexities of her new court, was stunned by the sheer audacity of the attack. The invasion of Silesia was the spark, but the wind fanned it into a continental blaze. Frederick's treachery signaled to the other predators that the Habsburg lands were open for plunder. In Bavaria, Elector Charles Albert dusted off a dubious, distant claim to the inheritance. In France, Cardinal Fleury, despite his earlier assurances, saw a golden opportunity to shatter the power of his nation's age-old rival. The carefully constructed diplomatic fortress her father had spent a lifetime building was collapsing, its walls breached by greed and opportunism. The young ruler was isolated, her advisors divided and demoralized, and the wind's treachery had blown away the illusion of a peaceful succession, leaving Maria Theresa standing alone amidst the gathering storm, with nothing but her own indomitable will to defend a crumbling empire. The Prussian invasion of Silesia was not merely a border dispute. It was the first terrifying blast of a firestorm that would soon engulf Maria Theresa's domains. Her generals, confident in the storied reputation of the Austrian army, assured her that the Prussian upstarts would be dealt with swiftly. They were wrong. On April 10, 1741, at the Battle of Mollwitz, the world changed. The famed Austrian cavalry charged with aristocratic bravado, but was decimated by the disciplined, rapid-fire volleys of the Prussian infantry. The Austrian army broke and fled, handing Frederick a stunning and decisive victory. The defeat at Mollwitz was a military catastrophe, but its political consequences were even more devastating. It was a signal to all of Europe that the Habsburg eagle was wounded and vulnerable. The metaphorical Monday of her reign had arrived, a bleak and unforgiving period where every new day brought worse news. Spurred on by Prussia's success, the coalition against her solidified. France, abandoning all pretense of neutrality, signed a treaty with Bavaria to dismember the Habsburg lands. Spain joined the pact, eager to reclaim territories in Italy. The Elector of Saxony, once a potential ally, also turned against her, lured by the promise of territorial gains. A massive French army crossed the Rhine, not to attack Austria directly, but to join with Bavarian forces, creating a formidable threat in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The firestorm was now raging on three fronts: the Prussians in Silesia, the Spanish in Italy, and the Franco-Bavarian force advancing up the Danube. In Vienna, panic began to set in. The ministers who had once preached complacency now wrung their hands in despair. Maria Theresa found herself encircled, her armies scattered and demoralized, her treasury empty. The ultimate humiliation came when her chief rival, Charles Albert of Bavaria, was elected Holy Roman Emperor, a title the Habsburgs had held almost continuously for 3 centuries. The firestorm had not just seized her lands, it was now consuming the very legitimacy of her family's imperial legacy. With the Franco-Bavarian army driving towards Vienna and the Prussians consolidating their hold on Silesia, the situation looked hopeless. Her enemies were already carving up her inheritance on their maps. Her own ministers advised her to negotiate, to cede territory, to surrender Silesia to Frederick in the desperate hope of buying peace. But Maria Theresa refused to yield. In this darkest hour, when the flames of war threatened to consume her capital, she made a decision born of desperation and genius. She would flee, not in defeat, but to rally the one force that might yet save her. She turned to Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary had always been a proud and restive part of the Habsburg domains, jealously guarding its ancient rights and often rebelling against Viennese authority. Appealing to them was a tremendous gamble. In September 1741, the 24-year-old queen, pregnant with her first son, traveled to the Hungarian capital of Pressburg to address the Diet. Dressed in deep mourning for her father, she stood before the powerful, armed Magyar nobles. Speaking in Latin, the official language of the Hungarian parliament, she did not command them as their sovereign. She appealed to them as a woman in distress. She spoke of her abandonment by all others, of the mortal danger to her kingdom, to her very person, and to her children. Then, in a moment of pure political theater, she held up her infant son, the future Emperor Joseph II, and wept. The effect was electric. The stern warrior nobles, moved by this display of courage and vulnerability, were overcome. They rose to their feet, drew their sabers, and roared their now legendary acclamation, "Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro Maria Theresa," our life and blood for our King Maria Theresa. They called her king, not queen, the ultimate acknowledgement of her sovereign power. Her flight from the flames of Vienna had not been an act of cowardice, but a masterstroke of leadership. She had secured the unwavering loyalty and, more importantly, the formidable military might of the Hungarian nation, forging a weapon to strike back at the enemies who sought to destroy her. The surge of support from the Hungarian Diet was a profound moral victory, but it would take time for their promised armies to be levied and equipped. And time was a luxury Maria Theresa did not have. While she was securing her alliance in Pressburg, her enemies were on the march. The combined Franco-Bavarian army, under the command of the Elector Charles Albert, bypassed a vulnerable Vienna and drove north into Bohemia, one of the richest and most prestigious jewels in the Habsburg crown. Their target was its ancient capital, Prague. On the night of November 26, 1741, under the cover of a snowstorm, French and Bavarian soldiers stormed the city walls. The Austrian garrison, caught by surprise and vastly outnumbered, offered little resistance. Prague had fallen. The news struck the court in Vienna like a physical blow. This was not a distant provincial outpost. This was the heart of a kingdom, a city steeped in imperial history. The loss was a strategic disaster, but the symbolic humiliation was far worse. The heart of her Bohemian kingdom was not just occupied. It was metaphorically burning with the shame of defeat. To compound the injury, Charles Albert of Bavaria, her arch-rival, entered the city in triumph. Within the hallowed walls of St. Vitus Cathedral, he had himself crowned King of Bohemia, a title that belonged to Maria Theresa alone. The act was a direct usurpation, a public spectacle designed to demonstrate to the world that the Habsburg dynasty was finished, and that its lands were now the spoils of a new order. From her court in Vienna, Maria Theresa could only watch as the core of her inheritance was torn away. With Prague fallen and a rival king wearing her Bohemian crown, the threat to Vienna itself became immediate and terrifying. It was the absolute nadir of her reign, a moment of profound darkness where the flames of conquest had consumed one of her great cities, and it seemed only a matter of time before they would reach the gates of her own palace. For the Habsburg dynasty, the province of Silesia was more than mere territory. It was a cathedral of wealth, industry, and strategic importance, a cornerstone of their imperial edifice. Its sudden and brutal seizure by Frederick II of Prussia in 1740 was not just a military defeat, it was a desecration. This was the fall of their St. Paul's. The news struck the Vienna court like a physical blow. The young Maria Theresa, barely 2 months into her reign, was confronted with a level of cynical treachery she could hardly fathom. Frederick, a man who had sent letters of fealty, had invaded without a declaration of war, shattering the established norms of European diplomacy. He justified his claim with obscure, centuries-old dynastic arguments, a thin veneer for naked ambition. The initial Austrian response was one of disbelief, followed by ill-prepared military action. The Habsburg army, accustomed to the more stately pace of 18th-century warfare, was unprepared for the speed and discipline of the Prussian forces. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Mollwitz in April 1741. Though Frederick himself fled the field in a moment of panic, his well-drilled infantry stood firm, repelling the Austrian cavalry charges and ultimately securing a Prussian victory. The battle was a brutal lesson for Maria Theresa. It demonstrated the superiority of Prussian military training and the inadequacy of her own commanders. More profoundly, it cemented the loss of Silesia for the foreseeable future. For the young Archduchess, this was a crucible of fire. The loss of the empire's richest province was a public humiliation that fueled a private, lifelong vendetta against the King of Prussia. It stripped away any youthful naivety, replacing it with a core of hardened resolve. She had learned that promises were meaningless, that treaties were breakable, and that the only true currency among monarchs was power. The fall of her Silesian cathedral shook the foundations of her inheritance. But in its ruins, she began to forge the iron will of an empress who would never again be caught unprepared. The loss of Silesia was not an isolated event. It was the tremor that signaled an impending earthquake. Frederick's success emboldened every rival of the House of Habsburg. It was a signal that the empire was weak, its ruler a woman, and its lands ripe for the taking. What followed was a period of absolute desperation, a dark Tuesday of the soul for Maria Theresa and her fledgling reign. A formidable coalition, led by France and Bavaria, coalesced with the singular goal of dismembering the Habsburg Monarchy. The Bavarian elector, Charles Albert, laid claim to the imperial throne itself, a title the Habsburgs had held almost continuously for 3 centuries. French and Bavarian armies surged into Upper Austria, capturing the city of Linz. They then advanced into Bohemia and seized Prague. By the end of 1741, the enemy was not a distant threat, but a clear and present danger, with Vienna itself bracing for a siege. Maria Theresa was politically and diplomatically isolated. Her advisors were panicked, some even suggesting she trade more territory for a quick peace. She was pregnant with her first son, Joseph, and her treasury was empty. In a devastating blow to Habsburg prestige, her rival, Charles Albert of Bavaria, was elected Holy Roman Emperor in January 1742, becoming Emperor Charles VII. It seemed as though all was lost. Pushed to the absolute brink, with her enemies closing in, Maria Theresa made a decision born of pure desperation. She fled Vienna not in defeat, but to rally her last hope, the Kingdom of Hungary. It was a tremendous gamble. The Hungarians were famously independent, often resentful of Habsburg rule. Appealing to them was an admission of weakness, a move that could easily backfire. Yet she had no other choice. This was her final stand, a desperate plea to a people who had every reason to abandon her, a last-ditch effort to save her crown from being shattered into a dozen pieces. On September 11th, 1741, In the Grand Hall of the Diet at Pressburg, the fate of the Habsburg Empire rested on a single, dramatic appeal. Maria Theresa, clad in mourning clothes for her late father, stood before the powerful and notoriously fractious Hungarian magnates. With her infant son, the future Emperor Joseph II, in her arms, she addressed them not as a distant sovereign, but as a woman in distress. Speaking in Latin, the official language of the Diet, she laid bare her dire situation, concluding with the heart-wrenching plea: "The very existence of the Kingdom of Hungary, of our own person and of our children, is at stake. Forsaken by all, we place our sole reliance in the fidelity, the arms, and the long-tried valor of the Hungarians." The effect was electric. The hardened nobles, moved by her courage and vulnerability, rose to their feet as one. They drew their sabers and roared the now legendary declaration, "Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro Maria Theresa." Our life and blood for our King Maria Theresa. They intentionally used the masculine term king as the ultimate sign of respect for her authority. This moment was the definitive turning point. The tide had turned, not through a single battle, but through a single act of political theater and genuine courage. Hungary, once a source of rebellion, now became her staunchest supporter, pledging thousands of soldiers to her cause. These forces, including the fierce Croat and Pandar irregulars, were unleashed upon her enemies. While her rival, Charles Albert, was being crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Frankfurt, Maria Theresa's general, Ludwig von Khevenhuller, launched a brilliant winter campaign. He recaptured Austrian cities and, in a stunning symbolic victory, marched into Charles Albert's own capital of Munich on the very day of his coronation. The psychological impact was immense. The image of the helpless young woman was shattered, replaced by that of a formidable warrior queen, backed by the ferocious loyalty of her people. The coalition against her began to fracture as the cost of war mounted. Maria Theresa had not yet won, but she had proven that the Habsburg Empire was not a corpse to be dissected, but a living, breathing power that would fight for its survival. The great conflagration known as the War of the Austrian Succession raged across Europe for 8 long years. The tide, having turned at Pressburg, ebbed and flowed through complex campaigns in Italy, the Low Countries, and Germany. Alliances shifted, commanders rose and fell, and the treasuries of Europe were drained to fuel the conflict. By 1748, a general exhaustion had set in. The great powers, having bled themselves for years, finally came to the negotiating table. The resulting Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle brought the war to an end, extinguishing the raging inferno that had threatened to consume Maria Theresa's inheritance. On the surface, the treaty was a resounding victory for the young empress. The Pragmatic Sanction, the very document that had been so contemptuously dismissed 8 years prior, was now universally recognized. Her right to rule the Habsburg lands was confirmed, and her husband, Francis Stephen, was acknowledged by all as the legitimate Holy Roman Emperor. The coalition that had sought to dismember her empire was dissolved, its ambitions thwarted. The great blaze was out. But as the smoke cleared, the embers of a deeper conflict continued to glow with dangerous heat. The treaty contained one provision that was, for Maria Theresa, an unbearable wound. It formally ceded Silesia to Prussia. Frederick the Great was allowed to keep the prize he had so brazenly stolen. While she had saved her house and secured her titles, she had failed to reclaim her cathedral. This single bitter concession ensured that the peace was merely a ceasefire, an interlude. The core rivalry between the resolute matriarch of the Habsburgs and the ambitious King of Prussia was unresolved. The war had ended, but the enmity had deepened. These dying embers of resentment and the unresolved question of Silesia would smolder for the next 8 years, fanned by Maria Theresa's relentless diplomatic efforts to isolate Prussia. They were destined to erupt into an even greater global conflict, the 7 Years' War, proving that the Peace of Wednesday was only a prelude to a future storm. The year is 1757. The thunder of cannons has become the grim rhythm of daily life in Prague. Maria Theresa's forces are locked within the ancient city walls, besieged by the relentless Prussian army under Frederick the Great. But on June 2nd, a new, more terrifying enemy emerged, one born from the very instruments of war. A Prussian incendiary shell, a harbinger of a new kind of hell, arced over the ramparts and found its mark not in a military fortification, but in the densely packed heart of the old town. It was a single spark in a tinderbox of wood, fabric, and centuries of history. What began as a localized fire quickly spiraled into an uncontrollable conflagration. Fanned by strong winds, the flames leaped from rooftop to rooftop with terrifying speed, devouring everything in their path. The narrow medieval streets, once charming and vibrant, became death traps. Wind tunnels of superheated air and choking black smoke. The sound of the siege was drowned out by a far more primal roar, the sound of a city being consumed alive. The great bells of St. Vitus Cathedral, which had marked the hours for generations, now rang a frantic, desperate alarm until the heat became too great and they fell silent. Citizens fled in panic, their allegiances and social stations rendered meaningless by the inferno. Nobles and commoners alike streamed towards the Vltava River, their faces illuminated by the ghastly orange glow of their burning homes. The city's defenders, already stretched thin by the siege, were utterly overwhelmed. Their leather buckets and primitive hand pumps were pitifully inadequate against a firestorm that was melting stone and turning entire districts into seas of liquid flame. As night fell, Prague was no longer a besieged fortress. It was a funeral pyre, a glowing wound in the heart of Bohemia, and a catastrophe on a scale that Maria Theresa, watching from afar in Vienna, could scarcely comprehend. As the fire raged, a most extraordinary and unexpected event unfolded. The very man responsible for the siege, King Frederick II of Prussia, watched the destruction from his command post on the surrounding hills. He had intended to break the city's will, not to erase it from the map. A city of ashes was of no strategic value. Its wealth, its industries, and its people were the prize he sought. Faced with a self-inflicted disaster that threatened his potential conquest, Frederick made a decision that would be debated by historians for centuries. He ordered a temporary cessation of the bombardment in the most afflicted sectors. Then, in a move that stunned both his own troops and the desperate defenders of Prague, he commanded his Prussian soldiers, the enemy at the gates, to assist in fighting the fire. Under a flag of truce, detachments of Prussian grenadiers marched not to attack, but to aid. They formed bucket brigades alongside the very Austrian soldiers and Bohemian militia they had been trying to kill just hours before. This surreal scene of cooperation amidst total war was a testament to the pragmatism of the Prussian king and the sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis. For a few precious hours, the lines of battle blurred. The shared enemy was no longer a nation or an empress, but the inferno itself. The Prussians, with their disciplined ranks and engineering expertise, brought a semblance of order to the chaos. They helped create fire breaks by tearing down buildings in the path of the flames, a brutal but necessary tactic that the city's overwhelmed defenders had failed to organize effectively. It was not an act of pure altruism. Frederick's primary motive was the preservation of his prize. Yet, for the terrified citizens of Prague, the sight of their besiegers working to save their homes was a moment of profound, bewildering cognitive dissonance. The king who had brought war to their doorstep had, for a moment, become their unlikely savior. When the flames finally subsided, leaving behind a smoldering skeletal landscape, the brief unity forged in crisis evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. In the blackened ruins of Prague, the search for blame began. The fragile truce dissolved, and the deep-seated animosity between the warring powers resurfaced, now poisoned by suspicion and accusation. Maria Theresa's court in Vienna was inundated with conflicting reports. While the initial cause was clearly the Prussian incendiary shell, rumors began to circulate of a more sinister plot. Whispers of arsonists and spies operating within the city walls spread like a contagion through the displaced and traumatized populace. Had traitors sympathetic to the Prussian cause deliberately fanned the flames? Was the fire's rapid spread merely bad luck, or was it guided by malevolent hands? The Prussian intervention, initially seen as a moment of mercy, was now re-examined through a lens of cynical distrust. Frederick's commanders claimed they had acted to prevent a humanitarian disaster. But to many in the Habsburg camp, it was a calculated piece of political theater. They argued that Frederick had only intervened to save a city he intended to possess, and that his soldiers used the chaos as an opportunity for intelligence gathering and looting. Investigations were launched by the Austrian Garrison Command. Interrogations were conducted in makeshift headquarters amidst the rubble. Every stranger, every person with a known grievance against the Habsburgs, fell under suspicion. The atmosphere grew thick with paranoia. The fire had not only destroyed buildings, it had incinerated trust. For Maria Theresa, the incident was a political nightmare. She had to project an image of strength and control while managing a disaster of immense proportions. Publicly, her government condemned the Prussian bombardment as a barbaric act against a civilian population. Privately, her ministers struggled to quell the internal panic and root out potential collaborators, creating a witch hunt that further frayed the city's social fabric. The ashes of Prague became fertile ground for propaganda, a grim chapter in a war fought not just with cannons, but with narratives. Beyond the strategic calculations of kings and the political maneuvering of empires lay the devastating human reality of the Great Fire of Prague. Once the smoke cleared, the true cost was revealed in heartbreaking detail. Nearly 1/3 of the city lay in ruins. Over 800 residential buildings, dozens of palaces, 8 churches, and the historic Jewish town were reduced to charred rubble. The architectural and cultural loss was incalculable, a wound on the soul of Bohemia. But the greatest toll was paid in lives. While the exact number of fatalities remains uncertain, it is estimated that hundreds perished, either consumed by the flames, suffocated by the smoke, or crushed by collapsing structures. For weeks, Survivors searched the ruins for missing loved ones, a grim and often fruitless task. The fire created a refugee crisis within the city's own walls. More than 10,000 people were rendered homeless overnight, left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They huddled in the undamaged sections of the city, in makeshift shelters erected in squares and gardens, their faces etched with shock and grief. Churches that had survived the blaze were converted into temporary hospitals, their pews filled with the burned and the injured. The demand for food, water, and medical supplies far outstripped the city's besieged resources, leading to the rapid spread of disease. News of the catastrophe sent shockwaves to Vienna. Maria Theresa, a monarch known for her maternalistic view of her subjects, was reportedly devastated. She immediately diverted funds and organized massive relief efforts, ordering convoys of grain and medical supplies to be sent to the stricken city as soon as the military situation allowed. This was not just a strategic setback. It was a profound tragedy affecting thousands of her people. The fire laid bare the horrifying vulnerability of 18th century urban life and the indiscriminate cruelty of modern warfare. For the people of Prague, the siege would eventually end, but the scars of the fire, both on their city and in their collective memory, would endure for generations. A somber reminder of the price of their empress's long and bitter struggle. The year 1748 brought an end to the War of the Austrian Succession with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. For Maria Theresa, it was a peace born of exhaustion, not victory. Her vast and diverse domains lay scarred and depleted from nearly a decade of relentless conflict. The treasury was empty, the army weary, and the very foundations of the Habsburg Monarchy had been shaken to their core. The most painful wound was the loss of Silesia, the richest of her provinces, to her great rival, Frederick the Great of Prussia. This was the landscape of ashes from which she had to build anew. The war had been a brutal education, revealing with terrifying clarity the inadequacies of her inheritance. The monarchy was not a unified state, but a disjointed collection of kingdoms, duchies, and counties, each with its own laws, customs, and powerful local nobility, who jealously guarded their privileges, especially the power to thwart the monarch's attempts to raise taxes and troops. In the quiet halls of the Hofburg Palace, a new understanding dawned upon the empress. Survival, let alone prosperity, demanded not just recovery, but a radical reinvention. Like the great architect Christopher Wren surveying the ruins of London after its Great Fire, Maria Theresa began to formulate a vision. It was not a vision of brick and mortar, but of statecraft and structure. She envisioned a modern, centralized state, an efficient and powerful entity capable of standing against the Prussian military machine and reclaiming its place at the forefront of European powers. This was a vision that would challenge centuries of tradition and upend the established order. She knew she could not do it alone. She gathered around her a cadre of brilliant and forward-thinking advisors. Chief among them, Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Haugwitz. Haugwitz became the chief architect of her domestic reforms, presenting a blueprint for a revolution from above. His plan was audacious: to centralize the administration, streamline tax collection, and create a large, standing army funded by contributions from all the crown lands, bypassing the obstructive provincial diets. This vision required dismantling the deeply entrenched power of the regional aristocracies. It was a declaration of war on the old feudal structure, a gamble that would define her reign and determine the future of her empire. From the ashes of a devastating war, a new Habsburg monarchy was about to be designed. With the vision for a new state clearly articulated, Maria Theresa and her ministers embarked on the monumental task of turning blueprint into reality. This was her grand rebuilding act, a series of sweeping reforms designed to forge a unified and resilient empire. The centerpiece of this endeavor was the administrative overhaul championed by Count Haugwitz. In 1749, he established the Directorium in Publicis et Cameralibus, a central body of government that merged the financial and political administration of the Austrian and Bohemian lands. This single act was a revolution, sweeping away a labyrinth of overlapping and often competing chanceries. For the first time, Vienna had a unified ministry to govern the core of the monarchy, enabling consistent policy and efficient execution. The most critical component of this rebuilding was securing a permanent revenue stream for the military. Haugwitz proposed the 10-year recess, a plan wherein the provincial estates would agree to a fixed sum of taxes for a decade, guaranteeing the funds needed to maintain a standing army of over 100,000 men. This struck at the very heart of the nobility's power, as it removed their ability to haggle over military funding year after year. The resistance was immediate and fierce. The nobles and clergy of her various lands protested vehemently, seeing their ancient rights and tax exemptions vanish. It was here that Maria Theresa's personal resolve proved decisive. She employed a masterful combination of persuasion, political maneuvering, and sheer force of will to push the reforms through, one province at a time. While she was restructuring the civilian government, she was simultaneously rebuilding her military. In 1751, she founded the Theresian Military Academy in Wiener Neustadt, the first of its kind in the world, to produce a new generation of professional, educated, and loyal officers. No longer would commissions be solely the purview of high birth. Merit began to play a role. Regulations were standardized, new training doctrines were introduced, and the army was transformed from a feudal levy into a modern, professional force. To complete the centralization, she placed foreign policy firmly under the control of a new state chancellery, led by the brilliant diplomat Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz. This comprehensive rebuilding act was a testament to her pragmatic and determined leadership. She was not merely patching cracks, she was laying an entirely new foundation for the Habsburg Empire. The reforms of the 1750s were tested in the crucible of the 7 Years' War, a conflict that once again set the continent ablaze. This was the ultimate trial by fire for Maria Theresa's rebuilt state. For 7 grueling years, her new army fought with a professionalism and tenacity unseen in the previous war. The centralized administration managed to fund the immense war effort without bankrupting the state. Despite these vast improvements, the war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Hubertusburg, which confirmed Prussian control of Silesia once and for all. The loss was a source of lifelong sorrow for the Empress, a dream she had to finally relinquish. Yet, from the embers of this final devastating blaze, Maria Theresa resolved to build lasting monuments, not of stone to commemorate a victory she did not win, but of enlightened policy to secure the future of her people. The war had taught her that military and administrative strength alone were not enough. The true power of a state lay in the well-being and education of its subjects. This led to one of her most enduring legacies, the reform of education. In 1774, she promulgated the Ratio Educationis, a comprehensive school ordinance that established a state-run system of education throughout the Habsburg lands. It created a network of primary schools, secondary schools, and universities, all under government supervision, with a standardized curriculum. The goal was to combat illiteracy and produce skilled, loyal, and productive citizens to serve the state. This was a monumental undertaking that laid the foundation for public education in Central Europe. Concurrently, she sought to create a monument to justice. She commissioned the Codex Theresianus, a massive project to unify the disparate civil laws of her territories into a single, coherent code. Though too unwieldy to be enacted in her lifetime, this colossal effort was a foundational step toward legal equality and rationality, profoundly influencing the Austrian legal code that followed. Another monument was her effort to improve the lot of the serfs. A series of robot patents regulated and limited the amount of forced labor that peasants owed to their lords, a humane intervention that chipped away at the harshest edges of feudalism. These reforms were her true monuments, built from the hard-won lessons of the Blaze, designed to create a more just, enlightened, and stable society. As the sun set on Maria Theresa's 40-year reign, the empire she passed on to her son, Joseph II, was almost unrecognizable from the fragile, crumbling inheritance she had fought to defend in 1740. Her legacy was one of profound transformation, a legacy built of both stone and safety. The stone was visible in the very fabric of her domains. It was in the magnificent Rococo expansion of Schönbrunn Palace, a symbol of Habsburg splendor and cultural power. It was in the new government buildings that housed her centralized bureaucracy, the hospitals she founded to care for her subjects, and the Theresian Military Academy, which continued to produce the finest officers in Europe. But the more enduring stone was intangible. It was the very structure of the modern Austrian state she had created. She had forged a unified administration, a professional civil service, and a common legal direction where chaos and provincialism had once reigned. She replaced a patchwork of feudal loyalties with the concept of a unified state, deserving of service and allegiance. The second pillar of her legacy was safety. When she ascended the throne, the Habsburg Monarchy was vulnerable, its territories prey for its ambitious neighbors. By the end of her reign, it was secure. Her reformed army was one of the most formidable in Europe, capable of defending its borders. Her diplomatic acumen, including her famous marriage policy that placed her children on thrones across the continent, had created a web of alliances that fostered stability. The state's finances, once perpetually on the brink of collapse, were now managed with a degree of order and predictability that allowed for long-term planning. This safety extended to her people. Her cautious but meaningful social reforms, her promotion of education, and her genuine concern for her subjects' welfare earned her the enduring title of Landesmutter, or Mother of her country. She had weathered devastating wars, personal tragedy, and immense political opposition to methodically rebuild her world. Maria Theresa's ultimate achievement was not in expanding her empire's borders, but in strengthening its foundations, ensuring that the great House of Habsburg would not only survive, but thrive in the modern era. She left behind a legacy of resilience, reform, and consolidation. A legacy of stone and safety.